Tonight, we open a door that was never meant to be unlocked. A former priest has come forward. He brings no theories, only testimony. And what he reveals could fracture the foundation of everything we believe we know. He speaks of hidden vaults, of secret manuscripts, of a timeline rewritten by the very hands sworn to protect the truth. For years, he served inside the Vatican. He walked the halls no one is allowed to speak of. He read the pages that were supposed to stay buried forever. This is not a story about forbidden texts or ancient rituals. It is a story about the control of time, of knowledge, of memory itself. Entire centuries were shaped in silence, while the world looked to Rome for salvation. Now, for the first time, someone who was inside is telling all. Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we hear from the one who walked away. And once you hear what he knows, there is no going back. They say the church never forgets, that once you wear the collar, it marks you for life. But what they don't tell you is what happens when that collar begins to choke you. I was once part of it. I prayed in Latin. I walked the echoing halls of ancient stone. I believed with all my heart. But the truth has a strange way of finding cracks. And once it seeps in, it never leaves. I want to be clear. I didn't leave the church because I lost faith in God. I left because I finally saw what was being hidden in his name. There are rooms in the Vatican that most priests, even those who live there for 50 years, will never enter. Corridors beneath corridors, archives under archives, a maze of stone and shadow where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. Keys are handed only to a select few. I was one of the few. At first, I thought it was a privilege, a reward for my loyalty and my discretion. But the deeper I was permitted to go, the more the light faded, until all that remained were questions no one was willing to answer. There was one night I remember with perfect clarity. A violent storm had hit Rome. The wind howled against the basilica, and the power flickered, casting the ancient courtyards in strobes of lightning and shadow. I was called to assist in a section of the archive that most people, even inside, don't know exists. No photos, no phones, just silence and dust, and a smell like dried blood on old parchment. I saw scrolls older than any history book I had ever studied, languages I couldn't read, but somehow, in my bones, I understood. These were pages that told a different story of creation, of time, of us. That night, something changed. It was like staring into a mirror and seeing a complete stranger looking back at me. I knew in that moment that the version of history I had been preaching from the pulpit was not the whole truth. It wasn't even a half-truth. It was a performance, and we were all actors reading from a script written long, long before we were born. I kept quiet for months. I went through the motions. I led Mass. I offered confessions. I smiled in the presence of bishops who held galaxies of secrets behind their eyes. But inside, I was crumbling. The lies weren't just in the texts, they were in the silence. In the books we were explicitly told not to read. In the names meticulously removed from the records. In the years that simply vanished. Eventually, I walked away. No ceremony, no goodbye. I left my collar on the altar and stepped out into the Roman night. Since then, I've kept my head low, but I cannot stay silent any longer. There are things the world needs to know. Not to tear down faith, but to rebuild it on something real. Not fear, not control. Truth. This is my confession. Not the kind whispered in a dark booth, but the kind spoken loudly under open skies. Because sometimes the biggest sins are not committed by individuals. They are built into systems, protected by robes, sanctified by rituals, and hidden behind gold and stone. If you think you know the Vatican, think again. Because what I saw was never meant to be seen. and what I read was never meant to be remembered. Until now.
My journey into that darkness began long before I saw those scrolls. It began in the monastery. The monastery was quiet, always quiet. But it was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful, like the cold stone walls themselves were listening, taking notes. When I first arrived as a young seminarian full of naive hope, I thought it was a holy place. I believed it was where my deepest questions would finally meet their answers, where doubt would be refined into unshakable faith. But the more time I spent there, the more I realized that the silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. We were taught how to read Scripture, but only in a certain way. We were given the lock, but not the key. If you asked too many questions, even kind, curious ones, the older priests would offer a polite, thin smile and change the subject. If you kept pressing, they would recommend prayer and fasting. That was their code, the gentle hand on the back of your neck, guiding you away from the edge. It meant stop asking. Some texts were studied in microscopic detail, every word analyzed for weeks. Others were mentioned once in passing and never brought up again. And then there were the names. Names you only heard in hushed whispers late at night, when the lights were out and 2 or 3 students dared to speak freely in the dark. There was one class, a dry lecture on early Christian history, that changed everything for me. The priest leading it was a careful man, nervous, always reading directly from his approved notes, his eyes never straying from the page. But during one lecture, he must have lost his place, he accidentally mentioned a gospel I had never heard of. The Gospel of Thomas. The words just fell out. The silence in the room changed. It became heavy, sharp. He paused immediately, his face went pale. He looked up at us, his eyes wide for just a second, and then said, "Forget that. It was not part of the canon." He shuffled his papers and moved on, but I couldn't. The name was like a stone dropped into a still pool. I waited and asked him about it later, just the 2 of us in an empty corridor. He gave me a long, tired look, a look that seemed to weigh the cost of every word. And in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "Some books were left out for good reason, my son. Not all questions lead to God." And then he walked away, his pace quicker than usual. That night, I went to the small monastery library. The lights were dim, and most of the truly old books were locked behind glass, their spines facing away from us. The ones we could access were all the same: approved translations, doctrinal summaries, biographies of saints that all sounded identical. But I started noticing what wasn't there. No original texts, no opposing ideas, no room for interpretation. It was just carefully chosen knowledge, repeated over and over until it became fact. We weren't just learning Scripture, we were learning how to think a certain way, or more accurately, how not to think beyond the boundaries they had so carefully set. It was subtle. No one ever shouted, "Stop thinking." They just steered you, gently, firmly, back on course every time you strayed. And over time, most of the students accepted it. They nodded, they recited, they passed the tests. They called it faith. But a few of us whispered in the garden after evening prayer, in the shadows of the cloisters. We spoke of the books we weren't allowed to read, of the questions that didn't have approved answers. We started to wonder, in those hushed, desperate tones, if we were there to find the truth or to forget it. In the monastery, truth wasn't denied, it was filtered. We were taught not to lie, but to never, ever stray from the script. And in that enforced silence, something ancient stirred. It wasn't faith. It was the cold, creeping feeling that somewhere out there, buried under layers of ritual and reverence, the real story was still waiting to be found.
It was never marked on any map. There was no hallway sign, no mention in any catalog, public or private, but everyone in the Vatican knew something was there. They just didn't speak of it. It was like a ghost room, a structural rumor built into the stone long ago, hidden in plain sight. And I found it by mistake. My curiosity from the monastery had been noticed, and in what I now see as a strategic move, I was assigned to assist a senior archivist deep in the Vatican Apostolic Library. They must have thought the work would satisfy my hunger or perhaps bury it in sheer tedium. Most of the work was boring, mind-numbingly so. Cataloging Latin manuscripts, dusting off ancient scrolls that hadn't been touched since the Borgias, copying inventory lists onto new ledgers. The main archives are a place of obsessive order. Every document has a place, every shelf a number, every corridor a name. But the deeper you went into the building, the more the air itself changed. It grew colder, heavier, denser. It felt like time itself slowed down, congealing the farther you stepped from the sunlight. That day, I was wheeling a cart of books down one of the lower basement corridors, a route I had taken a dozen times before. But this time, I noticed a side passage I had never seen. It didn't look special, just a plain stone arch, easily missed with a faded wooden door at the end. But the single bulb above it was on. That was what stopped me. That was wrong. No one had ever told me to go that way. The deeper areas were always locked, their access restricted to a handful of prefects. I should have ignored it. I should have turned the cart around and returned to my ledgers. But that same itch from the monastery returned, that pull from the shadows. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it gently. It didn't creak. The hinges were perfectly oiled. It just swung open onto silence. Inside was a narrow stairwell, lit by flickering bulbs, descending into the earth. No guards, no cameras, just silence and the smell of cold stone. At the bottom was another door, a thick one, made of dark iron and even darker wood banded together. It had no handle, no keyhole, but it wasn't locked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It wasn't like the rest of the library. This wasn't an archive. This was a tomb. There were no neat shelves, no labeled rows, no signs pointing to scripture or saints. This room was chaotic. Scrolls were stacked in precarious piles. Books without titles or bindings were heaped on stone tables. Manuscripts written in languages I didn't recognize, some not written in letters at all, but in symbols, were left open as if they'd just been read and abandoned. And the smell. It wasn't just dust. It smelled like age itself, like ozone and dried ink and something faintly metallic, like things left untouched for centuries. One parchment on the central table caught my eye. It was covered in symbols I had never seen. Circular patterns, intricate star charts, but the alignments were impossible, mapping constellations from a sky that didn't match our own. Notes were scribbled in Latin, Greek, and something else, something angular and older. The words weren't just telling a story. They were warning someone. I felt it, a cold dread deep in my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be read casually. I didn't hear the door open behind me. The silence in the room was so total it swallowed all sound. But suddenly, I wasn't alone. A figure stepped into the light. An older priest, one of the senior prefects. He didn't yell. He didn't look surprised. He just stared at me, his face impassive, and he let the silence stretch for a long, painful minute. Then he said one thing, his voice not unkind, but as final as a closing vault. "You were not meant to see this." He didn't explain. He didn't threaten me. He just walked over, gently took the manuscript from my hands, his fingers brushing mine, and closed it. He gestured for me to leave. I never spoke of it again, not to anyone, but from that moment on, I knew. The Vatican doesn't just guard history, it edits it, it curates it, and sometimes it buries it so deep that even those who serve inside its walls forget what they're protecting or why. That encounter in the hidden room left a scar. I was sent back to my duties, but the silence was different now. It was no longer just watchful, it was heavy, suffocating. My research, however, didn't stop. It just went deeper underground, fueled by what I had seen. It started, funnily enough, with a footnote, a single tiny line in a massive 1,000-page theological commentary we were assigned to read during training. It referenced a verse, just a fragment, that didn't appear in our standard issue Bible. At first I assumed it was a simple printing error, but the reference was precise. That tiny discovery became an itch I couldn't stop scratching. I began comparing Bibles in secret, late at night, long after the scriptorium was closed. I pulled out the official Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, the Coptic versions, even fragments of early Syriac texts, and slowly a pattern began to emerge, like a watermark held up to the light. It wasn't just one missing verse. Certain stories changed tone entirely. Certain names, especially female names, disappeared. Entire passages were shortened, rephrased, or blunted. Some texts had warnings scrawled in the margins by long-dead monks. Others had endings that felt abrupt, incomplete, like someone had carefully trimmed the edges so the whole messy truth would fit inside a perfectly clean box. There was one night I'll never forget. I had finally, after months of careful networking, managed to get my hands on a copy of the Gospel of Thomas. This was not through official channels. It was a digital scan, emailed to me from a scholar I'd never met, taken from a crumbling papyrus manuscript found in the Egyptian desert. It was raw. It didn't tell the story of Jesus like the others did. There were no miracles, no parables about seeds, no resurrection narrative. It was just sayings. 114 sayings. Deep, mysterious, challenging. And what struck me most was how it painted a completely different picture of faith. Not a savior from above, but a teacher of inner truth. A man telling people to look within themselves for the divine, not to follow blindly. I brought it foolishly, to a senior priest I trusted, a man who had been my mentor. He didn't even open the file. He just looked at the title on the screen and told me it was heretical, dangerous. But the word he used next chilled me. He said it wasn't dangerous because it was false. It was dangerous because it wasn't meant for public eyes. He told me the church had made a decision long ago, at the early councils, to protect the faithful, to keep the message clean and simple. He said the councils decided what was holy and what was not, what was inspired and what was inconvenient. That word stayed with me. Inconvenient. Not untrue, not evil, just something that didn't fit the narrative. I started digging deeper, obsessively. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which portrayed her not as a repentant sinner, but as the chief apostle, the one who understood the inner teachings the men struggled with. The Book of Enoch, with its wild, terrifying visions of fallen angels, celestial mechanics, and a cosmology that dwarfed the simple story of Genesis. The Gospel of Philip. All of them real. All of them excluded. Some hinted at a divine feminine energy, a Sophia or wisdom that balanced the masculine. Others talked about the stars and cycles of time in a way that felt more like astronomy than theology. Some challenged the very idea of sin itself, and every single one of them had been hidden away. Not always destroyed, but buried, kept behind locked doors or rewritten in obscure languages no one could read without permission. It became clear that the Bible as we know it is not a perfect divine record. It's a curated collection, a heavily edited anthology, chosen by men in committee, translated in ways that served a specific purpose. To guide faith, yes, but also to shape power, to build an institution, to create a hierarchy. When people say the Bible is the Word of God, they don't realize how many human hands touched it first, how many voices were silenced, how many truths were meticulously filed away under the label of heresy. And maybe the scariest part isn't that pages are missing, it's that we were never, ever supposed to know they were gone. My investigation into the missing books had opened a crack in my faith, but it was a seemingly normal lesson, a dry, dusty lecture on church calendars and holy days that finally broke it open. We were being taught how the date of Easter is calculated. It's a complex formula, but the core is simple. It's based on the first full moon after the spring equinox. Simple enough. We were all scribbling the formula in our notebooks. Then one student, a quiet young man from Kenya, raised his hand. He asked a question so simple, so obvious, that no one had ever dared to ask it before. "Father," he said, "what if the stars don't line up with those dates anymore?" The room went utterly quiet. It was the same heavy, watchful silence I remembered from the monastery. The priest teaching us, a kind man who loved his charts, smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He shifted in his chair. He looked down at his notes, then back up. Then he muttered something about ecclesiastical tradition and the authority of the council. That was the first red flag. It was the same answer, the same deflection. It wasn't about what was true, it was about what had been decided. If the church claims to follow the heavens, then why were we ignoring what the sky actually shows? That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed behind in the library long after Vespers. I found an old astronomical almanac and a history of the early councils. I started comparing dates. The more I looked, the more a cold feeling of dread settled in my stomach. According to astronomy, the spring equinox, the very anchor of our most holy day, had drifted, slowly, quietly, by 1 degree every 72 years. What used to happen in the constellation of Aries, as it did when the formulas were set, now happens in Pisces. The sky had moved on. The church had not. It had planted its flag in a moment in time and refused to move, claiming the universe should obey its calendar. I dug deeper. The calendar we use today, the Gregorian one, was created in 1582. Before that, we used the Julian calendar. But even that wasn't the original system. Civilizations long before the church, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the builders of stone circles, had mapped the stars with shocking accuracy. They tracked solstices and lunar cycles with stone and shadow. They knew when the sky shifted, and they adjusted their rituals. But the church didn't. It declared time. It named the days. It chose which festivals would fall when, and slowly, reality drifted away from ritual. One of the strangest discoveries, though it's hidden in plain sight, was that Christmas doesn't fall anywhere near the actual date of Jesus' birth. The Bible gives no date. December 25th was chosen specifically to replace, to conquer, the older pagan celebrations of the winter solstice, the Sol Invictus, or unconquered sun. Easter, too. It was placed to absorb the spring fertility rites that came long before the cross. It wasn't an homage, it was a hostile takeover of sacred time. I started wondering if time itself had been rewritten, what else had been adjusted, co-opted, or fabricated to fit the narrative. Some say it doesn't matter, that these dates are just symbols, that the meaning is more important than the accuracy. But when the stars above you no longer match the story you're told, something breaks. A profound crack forms, and through that crack, the questions flood in. If the church could reshape time, what was stopping it from reshaping history or memory or even the truth itself? That night, I walked outside into the monastery garden and looked up. The sky was clear, cold, and utterly indifferent. The stars blinked above me like quiet witnesses. They didn't care what date we called it. They told a different, older story, one carved in light and silence. The story the church tried to imitate, but never, ever matched. And in that vast, cold space between heaven and habit, I realized the stars were right. We were the ones who had gone wrong.
My obsession with the church's manipulation of time soon led me to an even more disturbing realization. If they could edit the calendar, they could just as easily edit the cast of characters. There's a hallway deep inside the Vatican's administrative wing that few people ever walk. No tourists, no cameras, just endless rows of beige filing cabinets, stretching longer than they should, containing the minutiae of centuries. I was helping an older archivist organize personnel documents one afternoon, a mind-numbing task. He stepped out to take a phone call, a call that lasted an unusually long time. I was told to stay in one room, but curiosity, as always, doesn't listen to orders. I wandered a little, just a few steps into the next bay of cabinets. That's when I saw the drawer. It wasn't locked. It was just an ordinary drawer, but the label was odd, written in old-fashioned script. I pulled it open. Inside, I found files, not on priests or bishops, but on saints. Names I'd never heard before. Saint Manulfus, Saint Labrada, Saint Zacharias of Bronto. They were typed out on neat Vatican cards, but something felt profoundly off. I flipped through the pages. Most of them didn't have birth dates. Some didn't even have locations, just short, vague descriptions of miracles, visions, martyrdoms, stories that sounded far more like myths or folk tales than real lives. Then one folder stopped me cold. It was a thin file, and a single sheet on top simply said in stark, modern type, "No longer recognized." That phrase chilled me. It was so bureaucratic, so devoid of emotion. It was like someone had quietly erased them, not with fire or violence, but with paperwork. When the archivist returned, I tried to ask him casually about one of the saints. He stared at me for a moment, a long, assessing look. Then he smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Not all saints stay saints," he said, closing the drawer firmly. "Sometimes stories fall apart. Sometimes evidence goes missing. Or sometimes it never existed at all." That answer haunted me. I started looking deeper, not into the files I wasn't allowed to see, but into the official canon, the recognized saints, thousands of names. But when I tried to trace the lives of some of the more obscure ones, I found dead ends. Churches dedicated to people who might never have lived, statues of saints with no verifiable historical records, miracles attributed to names that first appeared in documents centuries after they supposedly died. At first I thought, well, ancient history is messy. Maybe it was just poor record keeping. But then I found the internal memos from the 1960s. During a massive, quiet review called The Reform of the Roman Martyrology, dozens, if not hundreds of saints were quietly removed or demoted. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, was one of them, relegated to the status of pious legend. Dozens of others were labeled as suspected fictions. The church never announced it loudly. There was no press conference. It just happened. They just edited the list. That's when it hit me. Sainthood wasn't just about faith or holiness, it was also about control. It was a narrative tool. Stories of saints were used to teach lessons, to inspire fear, to shape behavior, to anchor the church's presence in a new town or region. And if those stories, those figures, needed to be rewritten, repurposed, or simply removed to fit the modern narrative, they were. But what about the people who prayed to them for generations? The villages built around their supposed relics? The children named after them? What happens when your holy protector is declared imaginary by the same institution that told you to believe? It made me wonder how many other names had been created or erased without anyone knowing. How much of our history was based on figures that only ever existed on parchment and in sermons? The church didn't need to burn books when it could just close the file, stamp it, no longer recognized, and move on. And sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't the ones that get told. They're the ones that disappear, quietly, with no one left to even ask why. That day I realized the saints weren't just holy, they were edited.
The first time I saw the chained books, I thought it was just for preservation. It was a common sight in medieval libraries, a primitive security system. Old leather bindings, heavy iron clasps, and thick chains bolted directly to stone desks. But as I stood in that cold, restricted room, I noticed something strange. These weren't books people were supposed to read. They were books meant to stay put, to stay closed. The chains weren't just to stop theft. They were to stop access. They were a physical manifestation of intellectual bondage. And the language inside them wasn't meant for just anyone. It was Latin, but not the clean, precise Latin we learned in seminary. This Latin was older, twisted, intentionally dense, as if it had been rewritten to hide more than it revealed. There was one manuscript I remember clearly. It looked like a collection of simple parables at first, but the phrasing was hopelessly complicated. Instead of saying God is light, it would say something like, divine luminosity is expressed through metaphysical emanation. That sounds intelligent, but it's a wall. It's designed to confuse, to make the meaning so difficult, so abstract, that only a trained priest, an initiated decoder, could understand it, or, more accurately, think they could. I asked my mentor, the senior priest I once trusted, why the church didn't just translate everything into common language, into the tongue of the people. His answer was simple and chilling. Not everyone can handle the truth. He said it with a straight face, a look of profound, misguided pity, as if protecting the faithful from knowledge was a holy act, as if truth itself needed a filter, a guardian. That's when I started noticing the pattern everywhere. Ancient texts, the originals found in Greek or Aramaic, were often clear, powerful, sometimes even poetic. But by the time they were copied into the official Latin Vulgate, everything had changed. Meaning shifted, key words were added, entire parts were left out. It wasn't just a translation, it was a transformation, a deliberate act of ideological surgery. One day I found an early Greek version of a gospel fragment side by side with its official Latin counterpart. The original Greek was simple, breathtaking. It said, "The kingdom of God is within you," a message of total, personal empowerment. It meant God was accessible to everyone, directly, without an intermediary. But the Latin version, the one that became dogma, had rephrased it. It read, "The kingdom of God is not for all to understand, that one change flips the entire meaning. One empowers the individual, the other controls them. One tells you to look inside yourself, the other tells you to look to the priest. I began to see that the real foundational power of the church wasn't in the buildings or the gold. It was in the words we were allowed to hear, and the words that were buried in layers of inaccessible language. In the early centuries, there were hundreds of Christian texts, letters, visions, teachings. Some spoke of reincarnation, others of stars and cycles. But the church chose which ones to translate, which ones to elevate, and which ones to lock away in chains. The deeper I went into those archives, the more I realized that language itself had become the primary gatekeeper, a way to keep the masses obedient. If you can't read the rules, you can't question them. It's not that the truth was destroyed, it was encoded, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in a Latin few could read and even fewer could truly understand. And those chains weren't just metal, they were silent. They were fear. They were obedience disguised as reverence.
In the monastery, they taught us that the Dark Ages were a tragedy, a time when everything simply fell apart. After Rome collapsed, the story goes, the world forgot how to think, how to build, how to dream. People stopped reading, science vanished, progress hit a 1,000-year pause. It was presented as a great, unfortunate accident. But what if that story isn't true? What if it wasn't just darkness by accident? What if it was darkness by design? That idea hit me late one night while reading an old lecture transcript buried deep in the Vatican archive. It wasn't even classified, just forgotten. The professor, writing in the 1950s, had argued that the early Middle Ages weren't as primitive as we're told. He said people didn't just lose knowledge, they were kept from it. At first I thought he was exaggerating, but then I looked into the records and the gaps. The gaps are huge. For almost 300 years there is a profound silence. We have almost no original writings, no confirmed inventions, no clear, verifiable history. It's as if time itself just dimmed. That's when I found the theory no one likes to talk about, the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that entire centuries, specifically from 614 to 911 AD, may have been added or erased from history. That kings and popes worked together to rewrite timelines, to hide things, or to give themselves more power. It sounds insane until you realize how much of our calendar was set by popes, how many documents we rely on are copies of copies of copies, with no originals to be found. But even if time itself wasn't faked, one thing is chillingly clear. The church controlled what survived. Books that challenged doctrine were not just debated, they were burned. Scientists who questioned the heavens were not just corrected, they were silenced. Entire libraries, like the great one at Alexandria, were wiped out in the name of purification. And the few places that still held the remnants of ancient knowledge, mathematics, engineering, medicine, were turned into monasteries where only monks could read. The average person was forbidden to own scripture, let alone study astronomy, or ask where certain ideas even came from. Knowledge became a privilege, and ignorance was repackaged as holiness. Curiosity was reframed as a sin. To not ask questions became a virtue. Some inventions we think were created in the Renaissance, glass lenses, advanced maps, complex mechanical devices, had already existed centuries before, but they were forgotten, or more likely buried. They didn't just disappear, they were suppressed, hidden in vaults, or destroyed to keep the world simple, dependent, and controllable.
A population that cannot heal itself, read for itself, or build for itself must turn to the one institution that claims to hold all the answers. The more I read, the more I realized that the so-called Dark Ages weren't dark because of chaos. They were dark because someone had systematically dimmed the lights. When truth threatens power, it becomes dangerous. And in those centuries, as the church grew stronger than any king or emperor, it decided what was sacred and what was sin, what was remembered and what was erased. It wasn't a time without knowledge. It was a time without access. And that is the real danger of forgetting. Not that things are lost, but that they are hidden on purpose in the name of order.
They told us the Jesuits were scholars, missionaries, men of profound learning and discipline. They dressed simply, spoke softly, and always acted as if they served a higher cause, a cause of education and enlightenment. But behind that public image of the humble teacher was something else, something far more secretive, something most parish priests never learn, something I only heard about in hushed tones after I had already taken my own vows. The Society of Jesus was founded in the 1500s by Ignatius of Loyola, a man who was not a theologian first, but a soldier. And from the very beginning, the order was different. Jesuits weren't just priests, they were soldiers of Christ, trained in strategic thinking, psychological insight, and absolute unquestioning loyalty. We all knew about their basic vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But whispered among the older clergy, the ones who had seen the inner workings of power, was a fourth vow. A vow you don't read about in catechism books. One taken only by a select few, and only behind closed doors. The fourth vow is simple in words, but massive, terrifying in its meaning. It is a vow of special obedience directly to the Pope, not just in spiritual matters, but in missions, in politics, in diplomacy, in silence. Those who take it promise to go wherever the Pope sends them, to do whatever is asked immediately. No questions, no hesitation. They bypass all local authority, and the things they are asked to do rarely, if ever, show up in the history books. I spoke once with a Jesuit who had served in multiple countries, always under different names, always in an advisory role. He said his work was spiritual, but when I pressed him, he gave a strange, cold smile and said, "Spiritual warfare takes many forms, Father." Then he looked away, as if he had already said too much. The Jesuit chain of command doesn't just end with the Pope. It runs through the superior general, the man they call the Black Pope. Not because of his skin, but because of his simple black robes, his title, and his immense, unseen influence. While the Pope, the White Pope, stands in the light blessing crowds, the Black Pope operates in the shadows. Few people know his name. Fewer still understand his power, which often lasts for life, outliving the popes he serves. He commands thousands of Jesuits across the globe, their schools, their universities, their missions, their networks. And while they preach logic and devotion, they also gather intelligence. They influence politics. They sit in rooms where laws are written and wars are planned, always quiet, always present. The fourth vow binds them not just to God, but to an invisible hierarchy of control. And once you take it, there is no turning back. You don't speak of what you do. You don't question your orders. You move like a ghost through the systems of the world, leaving no trace. And if you disobey, you simply disappear. Some say this is all legend, that the Jesuits are just educators. But I have seen the documents. I have read the unspoken codes. I have met men who were never introduced by their real names. The Church hides many things, but the Jesuits don't just guard the secrets, they enforce them. And the fourth vow is the lock that keeps it all in place. Not all soldiers wear armor. Some are waged in silence, in ink, and in a loyalty so deep it becomes invisible.
There is a room buried beneath Vatican City that almost no one talks about. There's no stained glass, no gold trim, just cold stone walls and a thick wooden door that absorbs all sound. They don't call it a courtroom, they call it a tribunal. But it's not like any court you've ever seen. There is no jury, there is no crowd. There is just a long, polished table, a single chair for the accused, and a handful of men in simple black robes who ask the questions and decide what happens next. They don't raise their voices. They speak with the passionless precision of auditors. I was only there once, as an observer, a quiet guest to something ancient and hidden, something that isn't supposed to exist anymore. They called it a doctrinal review, but the name was just smoke. What it really was a trial. Not for criminals, but for thinkers, for questioners. For those who dared to suggest that the world might be different than the Church had claimed for 2 millennia. The man being questioned was a priest, older, thin, with kind, soft eyes. He looked more like a librarian than a heretic. His only crime? He had written a paper, a scholarly paper, suggesting that the book of Genesis might be a metaphor, that creation could have happened in waves over eons, that science and faith didn't have to fight. He didn't preach this from a pulpit. He didn't publish it for the masses. He only shared it with a small group of fellow scholars in a private email. And one of them had reported him. The questions were sharp, precise, designed to trap. Do you believe the Bible is literal, inerrant truth, Father? Do you deny the divine creation of man as described in the Catechism? Do you submit without reservation to the authority of the Church's teaching on the origin of life? He answered carefully, respectfully, trying to explain his position. But it didn't matter. The room had already made up its mind before he even sat down. He was found guilty of doctrinal deviation. They don't use the word heresy much anymore. It's too messy, too medieval. But the punishment felt the same. He was silenced, forbidden to teach, to write, to even speak in public. His notes were confiscated. His reputation was quietly, methodically erased. No fire, no chains, just a quiet removal, a bureaucratic death. He was sent to a place of prayer in the Alps, and no one would hear from him again. Later, I found the old heresy files locked away in a cabinet, labeled with faded Latin. The names I recognized: Giordano Bruno, burned alive for suggesting the stars were other suns and the universe was infinite. Galileo, silenced and broken for saying the earth moved. And thousands of lesser-known figures, mathematicians, healers, visionaries, all punished for speaking too soon or seeing too clearly. The Church didn't just oppose science, it feared it. Not because it threatened God, but because it threatened control. Every new discovery shifted the center of power. Every new theory challenged the idea that only the Church held the keys to the truth. And as I watched that kind old priest being led away, I realized the Inquisition never ended. It just traded its flames for filing cabinets. The rituals, the silence, the quiet trials in forgotten rooms, they still exist. Not every prison has iron bars. Some are built with rules and fear and the quiet, administrative promise that if you ask the wrong question, you will simply cease to exist.
My descent into the archives had already shown me doctored texts, missing saints, and rewritten calendars. But the next discovery struck at the very heart of the institution's claim to power: the unbroken line of popes. It started with a simple, tedious list. I was assigned to cross-reference old papal records for a senior archivist, a task that involved comparing dates of birth, death, and official decrees. It was supposed to be routine, just names on a page, a dusty exercise in record-keeping. But something felt wrong. Some names appeared in one ledger, but were completely missing in another. Some popes had no background, no origin, no paper trail, just a name and a title, as if they had appeared out of thin air, reigned, and then vanished just as mysteriously. At first, I dismissed it as sloppy record-keeping. After all, we were dealing with nearly 2,000 years of hand-copied documents. Mistakes happen. But the deeper I looked, the stranger and more consistent the mistakes became. One name would have 3 different death dates listed in 3 different chronicles. Another had miracles attributed to him, but no writings, no coins minted in his name, no physical proof he ever existed. And yet the Church had listed him as a real reigning pope for over 100 years. I found one especially strange case, a footnote in a decaying text, a pope who supposedly ruled for just 10 days, then was buried in secret. No reason given, no details, just a brief scribbled mention in one document, and absolute silence in all others. No tomb, no portrait, no proof. And still his name was repeated in official Vatican chronicles as if that repetition alone made him real. It was like tracing ghosts. I brought it up cautiously to a colleague, an older librarian who had seen it all. He told me in a low voice, his eyes scanning the corridor, not to ask too many questions. He said that sometimes names are added to keep the timeline clean, to fill in gaps, to smooth out rough transitions of power, especially during the early chaotic centuries when politics and religion were so tangled together you couldn't tell one from the other. But these weren't just gaps. These were entire lives, entire pontificates, apparently invented to hold the structure in place. I started reading alternative histories, the writings of scholars, quickly branded as heretics, who had noticed the same things. They called them phantom popes, paper popes, figures who existed only in the records but left no mark on the world. In some cases, there were even debates about whether certain popes separated by decades were actually the same person under different names, their reigns sliced up and repositioned to make the timeline look more robust. And then there was the strange, persistent case of the female pope, Pope Joan, a legend fiercely denied by the Church but whispered in every corner of Europe for centuries. Some said she reigned for 2 years, disguised as a man, until she gave birth during a papal procession. Others claimed she was a warning, a myth created to scare or distract. But either way, her story, real or not, pointed to one thing. The papal record was not as flawless or as male-only as it claimed. In a religion built on tradition, the list of popes is sacred. It is supposed to be the unbroken line, the golden chain of apostolic succession stretching from St. Peter to today. But when you find weak links, rusted links, or links that never existed at all, the whole chain begins to tremble. The truth is, popes were human, chosen by men, not angels, and sometimes their names were written into history for politics, for power, or just to cover up a missing year. I used to believe the papal record was history carved in stone. Now, I know it is more like ink on water.
It was just another quiet morning in the archive, the kind where the only sound is the flick of old pages and the echo of your own footsteps on the marble. I had been assigned to catalog a stack of uncatalogued documents from a cardinal's estate, items that had been in private hands for a century. Most were harmless: sermons, drafts of papal letters, even old financial records. But near the bottom, I found something that didn't belong. It wasn't a book. It wasn't a scroll. It was a simple, worn letter envelope with no label, no seal, just a single strange symbol pressed into the wax. Not the cross, not the papal crest. Something older, something geometric I had never seen before. My hands were shaking. I should have put it back. I should have reported it. Instead, I slipped it into my cassock and took it to a small, unused carrel. Inside was a document, just a few pages, written in perfect, precise Latin, but in a style that felt rushed, almost panicked. The handwriting changed halfway through, as if one scribe had been replaced by another in great haste. The first few pages were confusing lines about astronomy, about timelines, about celestial alignments. But then the tone shifted. It started talking about a recalibration, a necessary correction of time itself. Dates were moved, events were reassigned, centuries were blurred. It listed popes and emperors who were relocated on the timeline, as if history were a puzzle board being rearranged behind closed doors to create a more pleasing picture. Some events, it described, had been duplicated under different names in different regions to fill gaps. Others were completely fabricated to cover long stretches of silence. The memo called it necessary for the stability of the Church and a correction for the spiritual good of the faithful. My blood ran cold. One section detailed with chilling efficiency how certain documents were to be altered, corrupted, before being placed in public archives, while the originals were to be sealed in the secret vault, the one I had glimpsed. It even had a list of the altered documents, with notes in the margin on what had been changed, dates, names, locations, everything. But the worst part came near the end, a single paragraph written in stark red ink that was less a note and more a curse. It warned that if this recalibration ever surfaced, if the truth ever came out, it would unravel not just church history, but the fabric of Western civilization. It would invalidate the very idea of progress, the legitimacy of monarchies, the credibility of our shared memory. And then the final, most cynical line: most will never believe it anyway. The illusion is too strong, too deeply woven into culture, education, and memory. I didn't know what to do. I could pretend I hadn't seen it. I could report it and watch it vanish again into the vaults forever. But something in me, the last thread of the man I used to be, finally snapped. I thought about the students learning history from books that were carefully, lovingly edited. I thought about people shaping their faith around timelines that had been adjusted like theater scripts. I thought about everything I had already seen, the chained knowledge, the ghost popes, the missing saints, the silenced scientists. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. I left the archive that day. I didn't return to my quarters. I didn't pack. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out of the Vatican, past the Swiss guard, and into the streets of Rome, the document still hidden against my chest. Because once you see the blueprint behind the illusion, you can't go back to pretending it's real. And maybe that's why they hide it. Not because the truth is too terrible, but because once you see it, you start asking questions. And that's what they fear the most. A world full of people who ask why.
History is supposed to be a chain of events, a logical progression. One year leads to the next, like footsteps across time. But what if some of those steps were faked? What if entire centuries were added, inserted into the record on purpose? That idea sounds insane, like a fever dream, until you look closely at the cracks. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. They call it the phantom time hypothesis. The theory is staggering. It says that nearly 300 years of our calendar, specifically the years from around 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. That entire gap, which includes the early rise of the Holy Roman Empire, was invented, fabricated, to make a lie look like the truth. At the center of this alleged conspiracy are two names: Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor, and his collaborator, Pope Sylvester II. Otto was a man possessed by an idea. He was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly obsessed with Rome's golden past. He didn't just want to be a king. He wanted to rule as a Roman emperor, to bring about the renovatio imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. But there was a problem. He was living in the 900s. To achieve his messianic destiny, he needed a more symbolic stage. He wanted to rule not just in a new millennium, but to be the ruler who ushered in the year 1000. It was a symbolic number, a holy number, a number that would make his reign feel destined, powerful, and chosen by God. This wasn't just about ego, it was about legitimacy. If Otto could link himself to the glory of Rome and claim divine timing at the dawn of a new age, he would be more than just a king. He would be a myth. And in Pope Sylvester II, he found the one man on earth capable of pulling it off. Sylvester, before he took the robe, was known as Gerbert of Aurillac. He was no ordinary priest. He was a scientist, a mathematician, a polymath who had studied Arabic science and mathematics in Spain. He understood astronomy, calendars, and numbers in a way that few in Christendom did. His knowledge was so advanced, he reintroduced the abacus to Europe, that darker rumors whispered he was a magician who had studied in secret. He would have known exactly how to manipulate the system, how to add the necessary centuries without anyone noticing. And back then, who would notice? Most people couldn't read. They didn't own calendars. Time was not a number on a wall. Time was what the church told you it was. Time was the ringing of the monastery bells, the dates of the feast days. So when the highest authorities on earth, the emperor and the pope, said it was now the year 1000, the world believed them. And history, what little of it was written, simply adjusted itself around the lie. But the evidence of the forgery, the proponents claim, is still there. Archaeologists have long been puzzled by the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. There are startlingly few reliable artifacts from that period. Architecture barely advanced. There are fewer records than you'd expect. It's like time slowed down or was filled in later with recycled stories. Even some ancient manuscripts appear to repeat themselves. The same battles, but with different names. The same kings, but in different places. Like someone copied and pasted old history to make new chapters. Even Charlemagne, the greatest figure of this era, is suspect. Much of what we know of him was written centuries later, perhaps, as the theory suggests, to create a grand, heroic lineage for Otto III to inherit. If this theory is true, then what we call the Middle Ages might be a carefully crafted illusion, a stage play written by men who wanted to control how the future would remember the past. And the Church stood at the center of it, not just recording time, but rewriting it.
The stars don't lie. They rise and fall with a precision that no empire, no pope, and no calendar can fake. Long before telescopes or charts, ancient people used the sky to measure time, to plant, to travel, to remember. And when the Church began rewriting history, the stars became a silent, inconvenient enemy. Because no matter how many scrolls you edit, no matter how many dates you change, the sky keeps perfect, unalterable records. I first heard the term chronoastronomy in a hidden corner of the library. It was written in a dusty notebook left behind by a visiting scholar. It means, simply, using the stars to check historical dates. Things like solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, and comets are mathematically predictable. They follow precise cosmic timetables. We can run them backward in time with computers and see exactly when they happened, down to the minute. So if an old text says there was a total lunar eclipse on the night a king was crowned, we can check that. And if it doesn't match, something is wrong. The problem is, many of the Church's most important dates don't match. Some historians, the brave ones, tried to speak up. Quietly at first, then louder. They used astronomy to show that some major events, like battles or the reigns of certain popes, may have been placed in the wrong century entirely. That some popes and emperors might have lived at the same time, even though the official history says they were generations apart. These weren't just minor clerical errors. They were deep structural cracks in the very foundation of the calendar. But each time someone got close to proving it, they were pushed back. There was one astronomer I remember hearing about clearly, a brilliant man from Eastern Europe in the 1980s. He had built one of the first computer models of the sky, running it back 2,000 years. He started comparing it to medieval texts and noticed dozens, even hundreds of inconsistencies. He gave a presentation at a small academic conference in Rome. A few weeks later, he vanished from the academic circuit. His work was pulled from the archives. His notes were lost. Even his name started to fade from records. Another was a priest, a scholar of ancient cultures who had studied star charts found in Egyptian temples. He believed they told a completely different version of time, one where events we call medieval may have actually happened much earlier or not at all. He tried to present his findings to the Vatican's Historical Council. They called it blasphemy, a pagan fantasy, and quietly revoked his credentials. The Church's official line has always been that faith and science can coexist, but that only holds true when science doesn't question faith's timeline. The moment the stars begin to rewrite the script, silence falls like a curtain. Some say the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 was just a correction, a simple technical fix. But what if it was also a reset button? A way to bury the evidence, to realign the forged timeline just enough so the cracks weren't so obvious. The stars are still up there, watching, waiting. They know the real story. They've seen every night pass without forgetting a single one. But the men who feared the stars feared something deeper. The truth that doesn't need a pulpit. It just needs light. And the sky has never stopped shining. They couldn't silence the stars, so they silenced the people who listened to them.
There is a room deep in the Vatican
that smells like dust, leather, and salt. It isn't the main archive most people talk about. It's older, quieter, and harder to find. You won't see it on any official map, which is ironic because that room is filled with maps. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, rolled up in copper tubes, locked in flat wooden drawers, or mounted under thick, distorting glass. Maps that do not match what we were taught in school. Maps that should not exist. I was only allowed in once, under the strict supervision of the same prefect who had found me in the hidden archive. The man didn't speak much. He just pointed and nodded. I was told to look, but not take notes, not touch anything, not ask questions. The first thing I noticed were the coastlines. They were wrong. Islands drawn in the middle of oceans that are now empty. Mountain ranges placed where there should be flat land. Entire continents shaped differently, as if the water levels were hundreds of feet lower. Some maps showed Antarctica, but not as a white blob at the bottom of the world. They showed it without ice, with rivers, forests, and coastlines. One map had a note in Latin scribbled in the corner. When I translated it later in my head, it said, "Beware the lands that vanished." I saw maps that included civilizations we are told were never in contact. Ancient trade routes that crossed impossible distances, from South America to Egypt. Temples marked in places that are still considered unexplored today. The more I looked, the more I realized these weren't just artistic mistakes or fanciful drawings. They were windows. Windows into a version of Earth we are no longer allowed to believe in. Some of the maps were clearly old copies of even older charts. You could see the layers of ink, the faded lines underneath where different hands over the centuries had tried to correct or erase certain names, certain landmasses. But under the corrections, the truth was still there, waiting. There was one in particular I will never forget, a small, beautifully drawn globe sketch dated from the early 1400s. It showed both North and South America, long before Columbus. And not as blank, empty spaces, but with names of villages, rivers, and even symbols that looked like pyramids. When I instinctively pointed at it, the archivist shook his head, a silent, firm no. He later said, "That one is not for public eyes. It would cause confusion." Confusion. That's what they called it. Why would the church keep maps that so profoundly contradict its own version of history? Why lock them away instead of putting them in museums? Because maps are dangerous. They show you not just where you are, but where you've been. And if enough people see the old maps, they might start asking why the new ones lie. Cartography is not just science, it's power. Whoever controls the map controls the story. They control the borders, the names, the memory of what once was. The Vatican doesn't just guard theology, it guards geography. And in those forgotten drawers are the roads to places we've been told never existed, or that were destroyed, or worse, that still exist, but are hidden on purpose. Maps don't forget. They just wait to be read. There's a strange pattern buried in the stories we're told, a subtle intellectual theft. The deeper you dig into the history of faith, the more it feels like certain names were swapped. Inventors were replaced by saints. Brilliant experiments were rewritten as divine miracles. Human knowledge was systematically turned into myth. It wasn't erased. It was rebranded, hollowed out, and filled with a new, safer meaning. I first noticed it while studying the records of an early monastery in the Alps, one renowned for healing. The official scrolls described people recovering from sicknesses that should have killed them, horrific infections, broken bones, raging fevers. The local bishop, in a letter to Rome, called it the undeniable work of the monastery's founder, a future saint. But in the margins of the original logbook, someone had scribbled notes in a different, drier ink.
Ingredients: willow bark, moldy bread, boiled water. Temperatures, procedures. It didn't read like a list of prayers, it read like a medical journal. They weren't just praying, they were practicing advanced herbalism and sanitation. Over time, I found more stories just like that. A man who could purify rancid water with crushed minerals and sand filters was branded a saint after his death. But his hidden journals, the ones not approved for public reading, didn't talk about God's intervention. They talked about chemistry. A woman in a coastal village who taught sailors how to navigate using the stars and complex geometry was later turned into a mystical figure, Our Lady of the Stars, who simply followed divine signs. Her original hand-drawn maps vanished. Only the prayers remained. It was like a switch, a deliberate, systematic choice to give the credit to heaven instead of to human hands. When I asked an older, more cynical priest about this pattern, he smiled sadly. He told me the church didn't hate knowledge, it just feared what happened when knowledge outpaced faith. If a common man can heal the sick, he said, why does he need a priest's blessing? If a woman can read the stars, why does she need the church's calendar? People start asking why, and when they stop needing blessings, they stop needing the ones who bless. So instead of banning all the useful ideas completely, they gave them new clothes. They wrapped science in holy robes. They put halos on the curious. They turned tools into relics. A complex astronomical gear becomes the wheel of a martyred saint. A telescope becomes the blessed eye of heaven. A medical book becomes a vision. One file I found told the story of a young man in the 1300s who created a device, a complex system of weights and levers to measure rainfall and predict river flooding, saving his town. He was immediately accused of heresy, not because his machine didn't work, but because it worked too well. The local leaders feared it would replace prayer, that people would trust a machine over the church's warnings. After his death, under mysterious circumstances, the church quietly canonized him as the patron saint of floods. His invention was called a divine gift, and the machine itself was hidden away, locked in a crypt. This wasn't just about power. It was about control over memory. If you shape how people remember the past, you control how they imagine the future. A future where all progress comes from prayer, not from trial and error. Where innovation is a divine gift, not a dangerous human spark. We think of saints as holy men and women, but maybe some of them were just brilliant thinkers, tinkerers, healers, and observers of nature. People silenced in life and then worshipped in death. It's the perfect crime. They didn't destroy the scientists, they turned them into saints. Because it's easier to worship what you don't understand than to admit someone figured it out long before you. They looked harmless, heads bowed in prayer, rough-spun robes dragging silently across cold stone floors, hands stained with ink from the endless holy work of copying scriptures. The monks of old were seen as peaceful, devoted, and silent. They were the gentle caretakers of knowledge, saving the light of civilization while the rest of the world burned. That is the story we are told. But what no one tells you is that some of them, the most trusted ones, were also spies. Monasteries weren't just places of worship. They were information hubs. In a world where most people couldn't read or write, the monks were the ones who held the keys to all knowledge. And with those keys came a power that didn't need swords or armies. It just needed silence and ink. Every large monastery had a scriptorium, the room where texts were copied by hand. We were taught this was a sacred duty, preserving the Word of God. But it was also an act of gatekeeping. Not every text was copied faithfully. I found documents, old letters from one abbot to another, with entire paragraphs scratched out and pages replaced. A monk once confessed in a letter from the 12th century that he was ordered by his superior to remove certain names from a local history, to rewrite the events of a failed harvest, to change dates, not because they were false, but because they did not serve the church's version of truth. Monks traveled, too. They moved freely across borders, quietly, under the guise of pilgrimage or delivering messages between bishops, but they returned with more than just prayers. They brought news, gossip from royal courts, reports of strange teachings in distant villages, warnings about heretics. They acted as the church's eyes and ears across the continent, an unparalleled intelligence network long before any government had anything close to it. If a village was building a strange new machine, or a scholar was teaching ideas that didn't line up with doctrine, chances are a humble traveling monk would hear about it first. Then the message would make its way up the chain from monastery to bishop, from bishop to Rome. Sometimes the result was a quiet visit from a higher priest. Sometimes it was a public trial. And sometimes the records of that village or that scholar simply vanished. One chilling file I came across described a monastery near the coast of Ireland that had received a book from a traveler, a text filled with incredible knowledge about tides, wind patterns, and the movement of the moon, far more advanced than anything known at the time. The abbot read it. He praised it in his journal. And then he burned it. He wrote that such knowledge would lead men away from dependence on God, that it was better lost than learned. This wasn't just censorship, it was strategic memory control. There were also hidden rooms, secret vaults under certain monasteries, where banned texts were kept, not destroyed, because while the public wasn't allowed to see them, the church still wanted to keep the information, just in case. It made me rethink everything I had ever believed about those quiet, candlelit halls. The chants, the prayers, the gentle routine. Behind the peace was a network of surveillance. Behind the ink was a knife. And the most unsettling part is how effective it was. Entire revolutions of thought were stopped before they ever began. Not with violence, but with a whisper, a note, a missing page. The monks weren't just preserving history, they were shaping it, gatekeeping it, editing it. They didn't need to control armies, they controlled the past. And when you control the past, you shape the future.
Most people walk into the great cathedrals and see beauty. They are designed for that. The stained glass, the impossibly high ceilings, the statues staring down like silent, holy guardians. It is architecture as an act of awe. But I was taught to look deeper, not at what was being shown, but at what was being hidden. Because inside these stone giants are messages, carved into the silence, messages the church never talked about, and perhaps never even understood. It started when I visited a cathedral in France, one known for its strange, almost unsettling architecture. Tourists came for the bells and the candles, but I kept noticing patterns, geometric shapes tucked into arches, perfect repeating ratios in the window placements, and carvings that didn't match any of the official stories. Lions with human eyes, angels holding tools that looked like compasses and squares, a spiral, the golden ratio hidden in the floor tiles of a side chapel. One statue, in particular, caught my attention. It was tucked away behind a pillar, barely visible, coated in centuries of dust, as if it were meant to be forgotten. It showed a man holding an open book, but the book wasn't the Bible. The letters were written in a forgotten language,
and his eyes were closed, as if he were guarding the knowledge rather than sharing it. Many cathedrals were built in the shape of a cross, a simple, powerful symbol. But I learned that some had secret blueprints underneath that simple shape. Labyrinths were etched into the floors, not as decoration, but as paths for meditation, their measurements tied to the movements of planets. The builders were more than just craftsmen. They were mathematicians, engineers, and, as some whispers suggested, members of secret brotherhoods, Freemasons, guilds that had inherited older knowledge. They were encoding ideas in stone that would have been burned if spoken out loud. Even the positioning of some cathedrals told a story. They were aligned perfectly with solstices, eclipses, and specific constellations. It was a kind of stone astronomy, baked into the very bones of the building. Why would a house of God need to align so perfectly with the stars, unless the builders knew something about the cosmos that they weren't allowed to say? I remember one carving that kept me awake for days. It was high up on a column, almost invisible. It showed a tower being built, but halfway up the stone turned into a tree. The branches wrapped around a globe, and the globe had no cross on top. Instead, it had a compass. Below the carving, someone, centuries ago, had dared to etch two words in Latin: quer in silencio, seek truth in silence. When I brought these anomalies up to the older priests, they brushed them off. Artistic choices, symbols of faith. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to be afraid of it. The more I explored, the more it felt like the builders were trying to leave behind warnings, or maybe maps. Not maps of places, but maps of ideas. Hidden truths embedded in rock, so they would outlast fire, censorship, and time. Cathedrals were supposed to teach the illiterate masses the stories of the Bible, but they didn't just teach scripture. They whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. The church tried to control all the words, but the stone doesn't burn. And when you start seeing these carvings not as decoration, but as defiance, you begin to wonder how much of our real history was carved in rebellion right beneath the eyes of faith.
Europe is haunted, not by spirits or demons, but by machines. Traces of inventions that shouldn't exist. Ruins of systems that no one can explain. Tools buried in dust that feel too advanced, too precise for the time they supposedly came from. They call them anomalies. I call them mechanical ghosts. My search for them started in an old monastery garden, overgrown and forgotten. But beneath the tangled roots was a system of terracotta pipes and stone channels more complex than anything I had seen in medieval textbooks. It wasn't just a well or a simple aqueduct. It was designed to filter water, to cool the air in the rooms below, and even to collect condensation. It was, for all intents and purposes, a form of ancient air conditioning. But no one knew who built it. The current monks said it had simply always been there. Then I found the sketches, hidden in the margins of a banned manuscript on astronomy. Tiny, intricate drawings of spinning gears, winding cranks, and moving parts. One looked exactly like a mechanical clock. Another looked like a loom that could program patterns on its own. The date of the manuscript? Almost 300 years before those machines were supposed to exist. Later, I visited a small church in France with a strange bell system. It rang every hour, on the hour, with perfect timing. But there were no ropes. No one was pulling them.
When I asked the caretaker how it worked, he just shrugged and said it had been broken for decades, that the ringing was a memory in the stone. I didn't believe him. I snuck in at night and found it. A massive wooden mechanism hidden behind a false wall in the belfry. A complex system of weights, gears, and levers, all powered by a steady flow of water from a nearby spring. It was, for all intents and purposes, a form of ancient air conditioning. But no one knew who built it. The current monks said it had simply always been there. Stories like this are everywhere if you know what to ask. Villagers who talk about ancient mills that could grind grain without anyone touching them. Bridges made of stone so perfectly carved they still haven't eroded after 1,000 years. Locks so precise they require keys that no modern blacksmith can replicate. Tools buried with craftsmen that contain metal alloys not invented until centuries later. Some say these were flukes, lucky inventions by solitary geniuses lost to time. But there are too many of them, and too many of them were hidden, buried, destroyed, or worse, credited to divine miracles. One document I found, a merchant letter, spoke of a tower in Italy that once held a machine capable of mapping the stars with incredible accuracy. The tower burned during a holy war, but survivors described cogs of bronze and glass lenses so powerful they could see ships on the horizon hours before they arrived. The church often called these creations dangerous, too close to magic, or worse, a challenge to God. Because if man could build wonders without divine permission, if he could map the stars or automate his world, then what did that say about the church's authority? So they silenced the machines, not always by smashing them, but by forgetting them, by burying them beneath new buildings, by removing their inventors from memory, by calling their creations fables. But the ghosts remain, in basements, in ruins, in texts no one reads anymore. They're the echoes of a Europe that was far smarter, far more advanced than we have ever been told. We didn't just evolve forward, we were pushed back, and the machines left behind are the proof.
The first time I walked into a church-run classroom as a young seminarian, I thought I was stepping into a place of light, a room built for learning truth, wisdom, answers. But as the years passed, as I sat on those hard wooden benches, I realized it wasn't a place to explore, it was a place to forget. Not forget in the usual sense, not like losing your keys or misplacing a name. This was something deeper, something systemic, a kind of quiet, patient erasing that worked from the inside out. The lessons were always the same. Scripture memorization, strict, unchangeable timelines, lists of saints and sinners, popes and councils. Questions were allowed, but only the right kind. If you asked why God created the stars, you were praised for your theological curiosity. If you asked why those stars didn't match the church's own calendar, you were warned. I remember raising my hand once, early in my training, to ask why the Bible didn't mention the vast ancient civilizations in the Americas or Asia that we knew existed. The teacher's smile faded. It was not a look of anger, but of deep, profound disappointment. He told me, his voice soft, "Some things, my son, are not meant to be questioned. They are mysteries. To pick at them is a form of pride." He moved on, leaving me in a cold bubble of shame. That was the beginning of the silence. Every book seemed to have missing pages. Every timeline had convenient gaps. The maps we were shown were simplified, with vast areas of the world labeled terra incognita, even when I knew from other sources that they had been mapped. The thinkers we were told to praise were all the same.
Augustine, Aquinas, a few safe philosophers. But there was no mention of the banned ones, no mention of the astronomers who were imprisoned, the engineers whose work was buried, the rebels who were burned. It wasn't just about what they taught. It was about how they taught it. Repetition over exploration. Recitation over reasoning. You were rewarded, given small privileges for obedience, not for curiosity, for silence, not for wonder. There was a chart on the wall in one classroom, a chart I will never forget. It showed the stages of sin, and at the very bottom, in small, precise letters, one word stood out: doubt. That was the core of it all. Doubt was the enemy, not just doubt in God, but doubt in anything official. Doubt in historical dates, doubt in church leaders, doubt in accepted facts. If you questioned the past, you were questioning the present. And if you questioned the present, you were drifting from salvation. Some of the older monks confessed to me later, in hushed tones, that they too had questions in their youth, but they learned to bury them. Because questions got you reassigned or publicly shamed or sent to a monastery so remote, so cold, no one would ever hear from you again. I found a hidden journal once in an abandoned school building tucked behind a loose brick in the wall. It was filled with frantic questions from students long gone. What really happened to Hypatia? Why did the stars not match the feast days? Why are some saints never mentioned in older texts? Why were certain inventions never taught? None of those questions had answers. But they had something else, scribbled in the corner by a different hand, maybe a priest, maybe another student. It read, "This place does not teach, it erases." And that's when I understood. The church didn't just rewrite history in books. It rewrote it in minds, year after year, generation after generation, until no one even remembered what had been lost. The school of forgetting wasn't a myth. It was real. And most terrifying of all, it still is. Time feels simple. Days, months, years, one follows the other like footsteps in the snow. But what if those footsteps could be rearranged? What if the calendar you trust, the one hanging on your wall, was built not to track time, but to control it? That hallway of history has a designer, and for centuries that designer was the church. They didn't invent time, but they shaped it. They bent it. They cut it. They hid pieces. They added others, all to create a version of history that fit the story they needed to tell. Most people don't think about calendars. We use them without question. But the shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar was more than just a scientific correction. It was a reset, a rewriting, a quiet, profound deletion of reality. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII announced the new calendar. The reason they gave was tidy and religious. Easter had drifted too far from the spring equinox, so they adjusted it. 10 whole days vanished. One day it was October 4th. The next day, people across the Catholic world woke up and were told it was October 15th. Their rent was due, their birthdays were gone, their saints' days were lost. Just gone. People accepted it. What choice did they have? They were told it was for accuracy, for God. But imagine the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it. Imagine what else can be changed when no one questions lost time. 10 days this year, maybe 100 in the next century. Maybe, as some scholars whisper, entire centuries were fabricated to begin with. The phantom time hypothesis, the idea that 300 years of history were inserted, Seems insane, but the Gregorian reset is the smoking gun. It proves that the Church not only would edit time, but that it did, openly, and the world just kept spinning. When I studied the old documents, I saw the chaos this created. Events that seemed out of sync, letters referencing rulers who shouldn't have overlapped, weather records that didn't match the new seasons. It was all a symptom of this control. Control the calendar, and you control memory. I brought this up once to a former bishop, a man I thought was open-minded. He didn't deny it, he just smiled that familiar, tired smile. The Church, he said, has always done what is necessary to preserve the truth. I asked him, but how can it be truth if you have to change time itself? He just added, sometimes, Father, the truth requires sacrifice, even the sacrifice of time. I left that conversation feeling cold, not because I was afraid of lost days, but because I was starting to see how deep the manipulation went, not just of belief, but of reality itself. Time is the most sacred, neutral thing we all share. It belongs to no one. And the Vatican, in its infinite wisdom, turned it into a tool, a weapon, a tool for rewriting history and burying what they didn't want the world to remember.
There is a story the Church tells over and over in 100 different ways. A town on the brink of collapse from drought, saved by a saint's touch, which causes a spring to burst from dry earth. A statue of the Virgin Mary that cries real tears during a time of war. A relic that speaks or bleeds. They call it divine intervention, a sign from God. But what if some of those miracles, the most famous ones, weren't from heaven at all? What if they were machines? In one dusty archive, I found a map to a ruined monastery in Sicily, built into the side of a sheer mountain. What had made it famous in the 13th century was the story of its fountain, a spring that never ever ran dry. Even during the worst droughts, the water flowed, cool and clear. Pilgrims flocked to it, calling it a holy spring, a continuous blessing. The priests said it was a gift from above. But when I finally visited what was left of the ruin, just a few crumbling walls and the fountain's basin, I found it. Carved deep into the rock beneath the ground were stone channels, terracotta pipes, and what looked like a complex system of valves. It was a primitive but brilliant water pressure regulator, a system designed to collect every drop of condensation and rainfall from the mountain and store it in a hidden cistern, releasing it with perfect, steady pressure. Someone engineered that flow. It didn't need a miracle. It needed mathematics. Another time, I read about a statue of a saint in Spain that was said to bow its head during the High Mass every Sunday. It was considered proof of divine favor. Hundreds saw it happen. The Church called it a sign. But hidden in a dry, unread maintenance log from centuries later was a note scribbled in Latin. It described the mechanism behind the altar, a set of internal gears powered by a simple rope and counterweight system, likely pulled by an acolyte in a hidden room. The mechanic who wrote the note wasn't confessing. He was proud. He called it a marvel of craftsmanship, the kind that was quietly removed once a town got a new, less imaginative bishop. Throughout Europe, I found blueprints drawn in secret. Designs for weeping statues with tiny hidden tubes leading to a reservoir in the head. Altars that miraculously lit up when certain prayers were spoken, using focused lenses and sunlight. Crosses that turned to face the sun at noon, powered by hydraulic power or magnetism. Instead of celebrating the brilliance of the inventors, they were labeled as miracles. Then the inventors were either canonized or, more often, forced into silence and forgotten. There was power in the performance.
If people believed that only saints or priests could bring about these wonders, it meant the church held the keys to the divine. Admitting that a mechanic, a carpenter, or an engineer made the same thing with tools and know-how, that would mean heaven wasn't the only source. It would mean humans had power, and faith would lose a little of its blinding shine. Miracles inspired fear and awe. Machines invited questions, and questions were dangerous. So again and again, the church chose the miracle. It buried the blueprints and raised the saints. It turned engineers into legends and inventions into blessings. Not every miracle was a lie, but not every miracle was holy either. Some were simply misunderstood science, dressed in robes and given a halo.
People talk about the Renaissance like it was a lightning bolt, a sudden, spontaneous burst of genius after 1,000 years of darkness. Art flourished, science returned, ideas exploded like fireworks over Florence and Rome. But what if it wasn't spontaneous at all? What if the Renaissance was planned? What if it wasn't a discovery, but a release? A carefully timed awakening, scripted by the very people who had been hiding the knowledge all along. When I studied inside the Vatican, I saw how many texts were locked away. Not just heretical gospels, but ancient works from Greece, Egypt, and Persia. Treatises on medicine, architecture, astronomy, and mathematics that far surpassed anything known in the Middle Ages. These texts weren't hidden because they were evil. They were hidden because they were powerful. They were the very knowledge that the Dark Ages had supposedly lost. Then, slowly, around the 1400s, that knowledge began to resurface. But not all at once. It was released carefully in managed stages. A scroll of Plato here, a manuscript on Roman engineering there. Copied, translated, and discovered, often passed to trusted scholars or powerful families like the Medici, who were closely allied with the Vatican. It was as if someone had opened the vault just a crack, enough to let a few brilliant ideas slip out. Enough to light the match, but not enough to burn the whole system down. I found letters tucked into unrelated folios between cardinals and early Renaissance thinkers. They didn't talk about discovery. They talked about managing the flood of ideas, making sure that new discoveries were attributed to safe figures, ensuring that the church could still claim to guide the awakening. They called it divine timing, but the language they used was one of strategy. Even the great artists of the Renaissance, I believe, were part of the script. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, they weren't just painters. They were initiated into this flow of released knowledge. Their work, their sudden mastery of anatomy, perspective, and engineering wasn't just genius, it was access. Some of their works, I am convinced, hide the very geometry and ancient codes they were being fed. Their art was a beautiful, public-facing puzzle, a way to reintroduce truth hidden in beauty. One fresco I studied in a private chapel had a spiral hidden in the clouds, a perfect golden ratio. That spiral matched the layout of a forbidden astronomical text I had once glimpsed behind locked glass, a book that mapped the stars in a way no one was supposed to understand for centuries. The Renaissance gave people the illusion of progress, but it was progress on a leash. Discoveries had to be church-approved. Books had to be filtered. Ideas that were too dangerous were delayed or erased. And those who pushed too far too fast, who didn't wait for the script, they were silenced. Galileo saw this firsthand.
He was praised one year and imprisoned the next. Why? Not because he was wrong, but because he said it before they were ready for that part of the script to be released. The more I learned, the more it felt like the past had never really been lost. It had been stored, locked up, and then handed back to a desperate world piece by piece when the time was right. The Renaissance wasn't an awakening, it was a reveal, and the script had been written long before the curtain ever rose.
Not all flames die in the dark. Some are hidden, cupped in careful hands, carried in silence from one generation to the next. While the Vatican worked to lock the truth away, others worked just as hard, just as quietly, to protect it. They weren't priests or popes. They were builders, stargazers, philosophers, and alchemists. They were the secret keepers, and their mission was simple: keep the light alive. They called themselves many names over the centuries: Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Knights of the Temple. To the outside world, they often looked like strange clubs, dining societies, or dangerous cults. But inside, their symbols told a different story. They were obsessed with geometry, with sacred numbers, with stars that pointed to ancient pre-Christian truths. While the Church wrote saints into the heavens, these groups wrote equations on hidden scrolls and carved messages into stone. I once saw a cathedral blueprint, a rejected draft from the 13th century that was filled with strange symbols. Compass shapes and squares, yes, but also notations that were not tied to scripture. They were tied to stargates, to ratios that matched the human body, to distant planets. It wasn't just built for worship, it was built to encode knowledge. It was a silent rebellion in stone. In one dusty cellar beneath a former monastery in Spain, I found a copy of a book the Vatican had claimed was lost forever, an alchemical text with gold ink that shimmered like starlight. It spoke not of turning lead into gold, but of the transformation of light hidden in all matter. The priest who had hidden it centuries ago had scribbled a single desperate warning in the margin. They tried to burn it. I made a copy. Pass it forward. The Rosicrucians were said to possess ancient Egyptian knowledge, secrets of healing and harmony, hidden chambers and libraries buried under the sands. When explorers returned from the Middle East during the Crusades, some, like the Templars, didn't just come back with relics, they came back with blueprints, with ideas, secrets the Church couldn't translate or dared not to. The Freemasons were builders, but they were also philosophers. They studied Solomon's Temple not just as a biblical structure, but as a code, a map of the universe. They believed truth was hidden in structure, in symmetry, in light itself. They didn't preach it from a pulpit, they embedded it in their lodges, in their architecture, and in the very layout of entire cities like Washington, D.C. The Church accused them all of heresy, of conspiracy, but the Church rarely accused them of being wrong, because deep down the Church knew exactly what these groups were preserving. Not fairy tales, not rebellion. They were preserving memory. I once met an old man in Portugal who claimed to be part of an unbroken line of these guardians. He showed me a ring with a symbol older than any cross, a compass within a flame. He said, "We don't fight them, we wait. The truth always returns, it just needs a place to land." That's what these groups were. Landing pads for forgotten truths. While the Vatican erased, they remembered. While the Church burned, they preserved. They were the counter-archive, the return of the light. And though they were hunted, silenced, and scattered, their flame never went out. It just went underground. And now, perhaps, it is beginning to rise again.
It is one of the most guarded rooms on Earth, not because it holds gold or jewels, but because it holds something far more powerful: memory, truth, and maybe even the missing pieces of time itself. They call it the Vatican Secret Archives, but that name is a trick. Secret doesn't come from the modern word. It comes from the Latin secretum, meaning private, the Pope's private archive. But it's not just private, it's hidden, it's sealed, and the world has only ever seen a fraction, a carefully curated handful of what lies beneath. The entrance is nothing special. A stone hallway, a modern steel door, a badge scanner. But past that door are over 53 miles of shelves. Let that sink in. 53 miles, underground, lit by flickering lamps, and lined with texts that no one outside the highest offices of the church has read in hundreds of years. Some are in languages no longer spoken. Some are written in symbols. Some have covers that, as one archivist swore to me, seem to hum when touched. I remember the first time I caught a glimpse of the real index. Not the public one, but the internal one. It was a single, handwritten, red leather binder, no thicker than a dictionary. But the entries inside, they didn't read like normal books. They read like warnings, scrolls from before the flood, banned gospels, do not copy, testimonies from heretics whose names were erased from history, blueprints of machines drawn centuries before those technologies should have existed. There was even one note next to an entry I couldn't decipher that simply read, "Do not touch, unless approved by the Holy Office. Contents unstable." Unstable knowledge. Think about that. Words so dangerous they're treated like radioactive material, not because of what they are, but because of what they could do. Shift belief, rewrite history, prove that we are not who we think we are. There are rumors, of course, whispers among the archivists that never leave the walls. Rumors of letters from Leonardo da Vinci, not just sketching flight, but describing its principles: angle, lift, thrust, like he had already seen machines that would not exist for 500 more years. There are whispers of maps showing continents that do not appear on any modern globe, charts that trace the stars in ways that do not match our current models, calendars from civilizations wiped out by time or by something worse. One former archivist, a man who disappeared in the 1990s, claimed he saw a scroll sealed in black wax. Inside, he said, were symbols etched in gold leaf. Not Latin, not Greek, something older. A language of pure geometry. He said when he looked at it too long, it felt like it was looking back. The church says the archives are restricted to protect the fragile documents, to guard the truth until it is safe to share. But how long is safe? 100 years? 1,000? Or is it never? Because if even half of what's listed on those shelves is real, then everything we know about human history, the wars, the religions, the inventions, the timelines, all of it changes. The hidden vault isn't just a place, it's a boundary, a wall between the world we know and the one that was stolen from us.
There's a version of the Bible most people never get to see, not because it's lost or broken, but because it was buried on purpose. Pages were ripped out, names were erased, and teachings that could have changed the very course of history were hidden beneath layers of fear and fire.
They called them heresies, a word designed to stop thought, to end debate. But they were something else. They were a different voice, a different story, a truth too raw, too liberating for the growing empire of the church to allow. These were the gospels they tried to burn. One of the most mysterious, the one that started my own journey, is the Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't read like the others. There's no birth story, no crucifixion, no grand narrative of a dying and rising God. It is just a collection of sayings. Raw, potent, unfiltered words straight from the mouth of Jesus. But the tone is different. It's personal, like he was speaking not to crowds, but to individual seekers. And one simple line stands out more than any other. The kingdom is within you, and it is outside of you. That idea alone, that the divine is not in a building, not in a priest, not in a distant sky, but inside you, could undo centuries of control. If the kingdom is within you, why do you need a priest to be an intermediary? Why do you need confession? Why do you need the entire hierarchy? Then there's the Gospel of Mary. Not Mary the mother, but Mary Magdalene. The woman who, I firmly believe, was deliberately rewritten as a repentant prostitute to strip her of her power. But in this gospel, her gospel, she is the one who truly understands Jesus. She is the one he trusts with his most profound inner teachings. She is the one the other disciples, particularly Peter, fear and resent because her wisdom threatens their new authority. In the eyes of this text, she was not just a follower. She was a teacher, an apostle to the apostles. When I first found scanned copies of these Gospels in a locked digital folder, in an archive I wasn't supposed to have access to, I felt like I had uncovered a crime scene. The digital scans were from originals that were scorched at the edges, like someone had tried to destroy them and change their mind at the last second, deciding to bury them instead. The Latin labels on the files didn't match the content. It was like they were trying to hide them even from themselves. There are others too. The Gospel of Judas, which paints the ultimate betrayal not as an act of greed, but as a painful, preordained mission. The Gospel of the Egyptians, texts that hint at entirely different versions of the story. Some say Jesus laughed during his betrayal. Others say he never truly died at all, that his physical body was an illusion. Some speak of a spiritual resurrection, a rising of consciousness, not a physical reanimation. All of them were banned. All of them were hunted. Why? Why go through so much effort to erase these words? If the official version is the one true story, why fear the rest? The answer is simple: control. The banned Gospels empowered the individual. They made the divine something personal, not hierarchical. They made God a whisper, not a throne. And that terrified those who were building an empire on obedience. The Gospels they tried to burn still live in fragments and whispers, and in the quiet spaces between the official lines.
There was a time when asking why could get you killed. Not asking violent questions or political ones, just simple human questions. Why do the stars move? What is the body made of? Where does lightning come from? In an age ruled by the church, an age they defined, even simple curiosity was dangerous. It was not encouraged. It was feared, because curiosity opens doors, and the Vatican, for centuries, worked to make sure that some doors stayed permanently shut.
Imagine a world where books were literally locked in chains, not just to prevent theft, but to prevent reading, where reading the wrong thing meant investigation, shame, and torture, where daring to draw the solar system differently than the approved model could cost you your freedom, your reputation, and your life. This was not a fantasy. This was Europe for hundreds of years. I remember reading an old, brittle letter buried deep in the archive. It was from a monk in the 1400s, a man named Brother Thomas. He had been caught. His crime? He was experimenting with lenses, grinding glass to magnify tiny insects. The letter was a desperate, failed plea to his abbot. It was short, and the ink was smeared. "They have taken my tools. I am not allowed to see what God has made without their permission." That one line broke me. He wasn't even defying doctrine. He was just trying to look closer at God's own creation. But even that, the simple act of seeing for himself, was seen as rebellion. The church claimed to protect the truth, but in reality, it controlled it. It curated it. Scientists who discovered things that contradicted Scripture, or more accurately, the church's interpretation of Scripture, were forced to retract their findings or face brutal punishment. We all know the story of Galileo. He was forced, on his knees, to deny what he saw with his own eyes. Not because he was wrong, but because he was early, because the world was not ready for the sky to contradict the Bible, because the truth didn't have the appropriate paperwork. Philosophers, too, were hunted. Men and women who questioned the nature of reality, of the soul, of time itself, were labeled heretics. Some were imprisoned for life. Some, like Giordano Bruno, were burned alive. Others simply vanished. Their books disappeared. Their names were scratched out from records. And it wasn't just about religion, it was about power. If people started to think for themselves, to explore, to question, they might realize that the church was not the only path to knowledge. They might realize that they too could find answers, and that scared those in charge more than any army. I once held a banned book on anatomy, a beautiful, hand-drawn thing. It showed muscles, bones, and veins with perfect accuracy. It had been copied in secret, by candlelight, by medical students who risked their lives just to understand how the human body worked. There were bloodstains on the pages, not from the drawings, from the people who had died to protect them. You might think that was all long ago, but the echoes of that fear remain. Certain books are still restricted. Certain questions are still silenced. The war against curiosity never fully ended. It just changed its uniform. The truth is, the church was never just fighting science. It was fighting wonder, that spark in the human soul that refuses to settle for easy answers, that hunger to understand. When curiosity became a crime, knowledge became contraband, and history was shaped not by what we learned, but by what we were never allowed to ask.
It didn't start with torture. That came later. It started with doubt. It started with quiet warnings whispered in church halls, with looks exchanged across candlelit rooms. It was a slow, creeping fear that grew not from violence, but from the possibility of it. The knowledge that if you thought the wrong thing, or read the wrong words, or even dreamed too far outside the approved lines,
you could be accused, not of evil, but of heresy. And in those days, heresy was worse than any crime. It was a crack in the perfect wall. It was a danger to the illusion. The Inquisition didn't just go after witches or rebels. It went after thinkers. It hunted artists, healers, astronomers, and philosophers, people who dared to imagine a world that didn't fit the narrow, suffocating script approved by Rome. Their most effective tools weren't the racks and the flames. They used silence. They used shame. They turned neighbors into spies, students into snitches, and families into witnesses against their own. I remember reading a trial transcript. A young woman, a baker's wife, was on trial. Her crime? She had asked in confession if animals had souls. She just asked. The priest reported her. She was taken, interrogated, and accused of having unnatural thoughts. Her entire life unraveled. Her family was shamed, all from a single innocent question. That is how fragile reason became, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. So schools began to teach obedience over thought. Stories replaced science. Saints replaced scholars. Wonder was relabeled as temptation. And over time, the human mind bent inward, not out of stupidity, but out of survival. It was safer to believe than to doubt. It was safer to repeat than to explore. It was safer to fear the unknown than to reach for it. Generations grew up inside that invisible cage, not even knowing it was a cage. That is the cruelest part. When the bars are made of tradition and the lock is made of guilt, you don't even try the door. You learn to sit quietly. You learn to pray when you want to ask, to obey when you want to build. I once saw a book of inventions hidden in a wall, sketched out in secret. Designs centuries ahead of their time. Gears that could move water to entire cities. Ideas for clean sanitation systems. Detailed drawings for flight. All sketched in secret, all hidden away. Because their creators knew. They knew they would be burned before their machines ever moved. The Inquisition didn't just torture bodies, it broke the imagination of a continent. It rewrote what was acceptable to feel, to wonder. And when you train enough minds for enough centuries to fear their own thoughts, you don't need chains anymore. The prison lives inside. But thought is patient, and some people, the brave ones, kept the old ideas alive. In code, in carvings, in paintings that seemed religious but carried messages only the curious could see. The mind can be silenced, but not forever. And every time someone remembers to ask why, that silence cracks just a little, until one day the questions flood back in and the world begins to think again. Not because permission was given, but because fear finally ran out of power.
They didn't wear crowns, they didn't lead armies, they didn't march into cities waving flags, but they conquered more than any empire ever could. They shaped minds, they controlled memory, they bent history itself to their design. They were the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and their empire wasn't built on land or gold. It was built in silence. It was an empire of the mind. At first, they looked like just another religious order.
educated, disciplined, devoted. But beneath the simple black robes and the rituals of faith was something far more calculated, a strategy, a system. They understood, in a way no one else did, that the true battlefield wasn't out in the world. It was inside the classroom, inside the courtroom, inside the mind. I remember the first time I saw the chart, a hand-drawn map from a dusty drawer in the archives. It didn't mark countries or borders. It marked influence, universities, royal advisorships, publishing houses, political confessions. Every single dot was a place where a Jesuit had once served or still did. It looked less like a religious mission and more like a spider web wrapped around the globe. They started with schools, not just any schools, but the best ones. They trained princes, they taught diplomats, they wrote the textbooks. If you learned Latin, advanced mathematics, philosophy, or theology in the 16th, 17th, or 18th centuries, chances are you learned it from a Jesuit. And with every lesson in logic or rhetoric came something else, a subtle shaping, a narrowing of possibility. You didn't just learn facts, you learned how to think, and more importantly, how not to. Then came the courts, not as lawyers, but as confessors. They became the spiritual advisors to kings, queens, and generals, whispering behind thrones, offering guidance in the name of God, but also in the name of policy. The Jesuits weren't just men of faith, they were men of strategy. They mastered the art of casuistry, bending moral rules to fit the greater good. They kept records, they tracked secrets, they knew who owed what to whom. Some historians say they knew of battles before the armies did, that they could stop wars with a letter or start them with a rumor. Governments took notice. Some feared them, others welcomed them. Some countries even banned them outright, seeing them as a fifth column. But even exile couldn't stop the mission. They went underground, changed their names, and continued the work, always teaching, always guiding, always watching. One document I found, a Jesuit's private letter, simply said, "The pen is the greatest sword." Their true power was never about force, it was about formation. You don't need to fight a king if you were the one who taught his son. You don't need to burn books if you are the one who writes them first. People still see the Jesuits as a religious group, and they are. But they are also the architects of modern thought, the engineers of memory, the guardians of a version of history that serves something far deeper than faith. Their empire was never loud, never flashy, but it was, and is, vast. It is a quiet empire, and silence has always been their sharpest weapon.
There are things the Church still fears. Not bombs or protests or angry letters. It fears questions. Old questions that never got their answers. Questions that pull at the threads they have worked for 2 millennia to bury. They don't fear these questions because they don't know the answers. They fear them because they do. The truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits in silence, in locked drawers, in crumbling scrolls with names no one is allowed to say out loud. And the biggest secret, the one that holds the entire structure up, isn't about angels or demons or even about Jesus. It's about time. It's about who wrote the story we all live inside, and more importantly, what they left out on purpose. If people found out that entire centuries were forged, that calendars were adjusted to create a prophecy, or that the stars we see in the sky don't match the dates we're told, the illusion would collapse. If they saw how brilliant science was swapped for simplistic miracles and how entire advanced civilizations were painted over by fictional saints, the cracks would be too big to hide. They fear the Gospel of Thomas because it says the kingdom of God is already here, inside you, not for sale. They fear Mary Magdalene because she wasn't just a follower, she was a teacher who understood things the men did not. They fear old maps that show continents that no longer exist and machines that predate the church by thousands of years, not because these things are evil, but because they prove we have been lied to. The illusion works because it feels complete. You grow up learning that history is settled, that the past is a straight line, but it's not. It's full of edits, blanks, and substitutions. And behind each change is a single motive: control. Because if you control the past, you decide who matters now. You decide what people are allowed to dream about tomorrow. What they still fear most is curiosity. Real, untamed curiosity. The kind that doesn't stop at Sunday school answers or dusty textbooks. The kind that reads the banned books and asks why this chapter is missing. The kind that looks at the stars and wonders why they don't match the church's calendar. The kind that hears silence and listens closer. They fear the return of forgotten names, names that once opened doors and healed bodies and moved stone with sound. They fear someone walking into a cathedral and realizing the carvings aren't just decoration, they're instructions. They fear that once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen, that memory will wake up and refuse to go back to sleep. This journey, my confession, was never about destroying faith. It was about freeing it. It's about lifting the veil and letting people choose what to believe with their eyes wide open. Because a faith that is built on fear isn't faith, it's control. So if you have made it this far, you already feel it. That itch in the back of your mind, that persistent nagging sense that something doesn't add up. Don't ignore it. Follow it. Question everything. Because the greatest fear of those in power is not rebellion, it's remembrance. And sometimes remembering is the most dangerous and the most important thing you can possibly do.